2 weeks before my wedding, the woman I had planned to spend my life with sat across from me at our kitchen table, folded her hands the way she always did before saying something she had rehearsed, and told me that if I did not make her the primary beneficiary of my will, there would be no wedding. I remember the sound of the refrigerator humming behind her, the smell of the coffee going cold between us, and the strange, sinking clarity that comes when someone you love finally shows you who they really are. Before I tell you what happened next, and how one quiet decision changed the direction of my entire life, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the idea that hope can survive even our darkest moments, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one matter more when we carry them together as a community, so if you're new here, consider joining our family of viewers who believe that even heartbreak can lead somewhere good. My name is Grant Whitfield, and at the time all of this happened, I was 34 years old, living in a modest brick house in a quiet suburb outside Portland, working as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm that built bridges and water treatment plants, the unglamorous kind of infrastructure that nobody thinks about until it fails. I had spent most of my 20s building a career instead of a personal life, and by the time I met Vanessa Cole at a mutual friend's dinner party, I was more than ready to stop being alone. She was magnetic in a way that made rooms feel warmer when she walked into them, quick with a joke, generous with her attention, and for the first 8 months of knowing her, I believed I had found the person I had been waiting for. Our courtship was, by most measures, a happy one. We took weekend trips to the coast, cooked elaborate dinners we mostly burned, and spent long evenings talking about the kind of life we wanted to build together. She told me about her difficult childhood, about a father who left when she was 9 and a mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, and I found myself wanting to give her the security she had never had. When I proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the Columbia River Gorge, she cried so hard she could barely say yes, and I remember thinking that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. What Vanessa did not know, at least not fully, was that 18 months before our engagement, my mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had passed away after a long battle with pancreatic cancer, and had left me the bulk of her modest but meaningful estate. It was not a fortune by any stretch, but it included the lake house in Central Oregon where I had spent every childhood summer, a life insurance policy worth just over $400,000, and a small trust fund she had specifically earmarked for my younger brother, Simon, who lived with cerebral palsy and required ongoing care that our family had always shouldered together. My mother's final words to me, spoken in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and wilting flowers, were that I should protect Simon no matter what else happened in my life, because he did not have the ability to protect himself. I had promised her I would, and it was a promise I intended to keep long before Vanessa ever asked me to rewrite it. I had not spoken much about the details of my mother's estate with Vanessa, partly out of grief and partly because it never felt like the kind of thing you brought up over dinner. I assumed, foolishly perhaps, that love did not need spreadsheets. But a few months before the wedding, Vanessa began asking pointed questions, first casually, then with an edge that surprised me. She wanted to know what would happen to the lake house if something happened to me. She wanted to know who was listed on my life insurance. She wanted to know why Simon's trust existed separately instead of simply being folded into whatever we would eventually share as husband and wife. I tried to explain, gently at first, that Simon's trust was untouchable, that it was my mother's dying wish, and that it existed to ensure he would never end up in a state facility if something happened to our aging aunt, who currently served as his primary caregiver. Vanessa nodded along during these conversations, and I believed, in my naivety, that she understood. It was only later, going through old text messages after everything fell apart, that I discovered she had been having a very different conversation with her closest friend, a woman named Priya who worked in marketing and who Vanessa trusted with everything. In those messages, Vanessa had written that she deserved to be taken care of, that she had spent her whole life with nothing and it was time someone finally gave her security, and that if I truly loved her, I would prove it with paperwork, not just promises. The confrontation itself happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early June, sunlight pouring through the kitchen window in that particular golden way that Pacific Northwest summers sometimes offer as an apology for all the gray months before them. Vanessa had asked me to sit down, said we needed to talk about the will before the wedding, and I remember feeling a small flutter of unease even before she spoke, the kind of instinct you learn to trust the older you get. She told me, in a voice that was calm and rehearsed rather than emotional, that she had been thinking about our future, about what would happen if I died unexpectedly, and that she did not feel safe marrying a man whose will named his brother's trust in a lake house before it named his own wife. She said the words that would replay in my mind for months afterward, that if I was not willing to make her the primary beneficiary of everything, including Simon's trust and my mother's estate, then she did not see a future for us, and there would be no wedding. I sat there for a long moment, the coffee going cold, and I felt something inside me quietly break and then, just as quietly, reassemble into something clearer than it had been in months. I asked her if she understood what she was asking, if she understood that Simon could not advocate for himself, that the trust existed because our mother had spent her final weeks on earth worrying about what would happen to her most vulnerable child after she was gone. Vanessa's answer was that Simon was not her responsibility, that she had not signed up to spend her life financially supporting someone else's brother, and that I needed to decide what mattered more to her, our marriage or my family's obligations. I remember the silence that followed, thick and total, broken only by the refrigerator's hum and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street, ordinary noises for a moment that felt anything but ordinary. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her of anything in that moment, though the accusations were already forming quietly in the back of my mind. I simply told her I needed time to think, and she seemed satisfied with that, apparently confident that time would bend me toward her demand. What she did not know was that time would take me somewhere entirely different. I spent that evening not sleeping, staring at the ceiling of the guest room where I had retreated, turning over every conversation we had ever had about money, about security, about family, searching for the moment I had missed, the crack in the foundation I had failed to notice while I was busy falling in love with the version of her I wanted to see. The next morning, instead of calling Vanessa, I called my mother's old friend and financial advisor, a steady, plain-spoken woman named Rosalind Ferris who had helped my mother structure her estate in the final year of her life. I told Rosalind everything, the ultimatum, the trust, the fear rising in my chest that I was about to make a decision that would define the rest of my life either through cowardice or through courage. Rosalind listened without judgment, the way good advisors do, and then she said something I have never forgotten. She told me that any partner who asks you to choose between them and a disabled family member's basic security is not asking you to prove your love, they are asking you to prove your obedience, and those are not the same thing. That conversation was the turning point, though it did not feel dramatic in the moment, only quietly decisive, the way important choices in real life often are, without the swelling music or the perfect lighting that fiction gives us. I asked Rosalind to help me revise my will, not to punish Vanessa, but to protect what actually mattered, and over the following week, working during my lunch breaks and in the early mornings before work, we restructured everything. Simon's trust was moved into an irrevocable arrangement that could not be touched, altered, or dissolved by anyone, including a future spouse, without a court order and clear evidence of Simon's own consent through his appointed guardian. The lake house was placed into a family trust shared equally between myself, Simon's care fund, and my Aunt Dorothy, who had given up her own retirement plans to care for my brother after our mother passed. And rather than naming Vanessa as primary beneficiary of my life insurance, I left that designation as it already stood, split between Simon's trust and a scholarship fund my mother had started years earlier for children of cancer patients in our local community, a cause that had come to mean everything to our family during her illness. When I finally sat Vanessa down again, this time on a Saturday morning with the sun streaming gently through the living room curtains, I told her what I had done. I watched her face shift through several expressions in rapid succession, confusion, disbelief, and finally something colder and more familiar, an anger that had clearly been sitting just beneath the surface long before this conversation, waiting for a reason to surface. She asked me if I understood what I was doing, if I understood that I was choosing a disabled brother and a dead woman's charity over the woman I claimed to love. I told her, as gently as I could manage while my hands trembled slightly beneath the table, that I was not choosing anyone over her, I was simply refusing to let anyone, including her, use my mother's dying wish as a bargaining chip. I told her that real love does not come with ultimatums attached to inheritance paperwork, and that if she truly could not marry a man whose will protected his vulnerable brother, then perhaps she had never really wanted to marry me at all, only what she believed I could provide. Vanessa did not cry. She did not apologize. She stood up, gathered the engagement ring from where it had been resting on her finger for the better part of a year, and set it on the table between us with a small, deliberate click, the kind of sound that seems too quiet for the weight of what it represents. She told me I would regret this, that I was choosing loneliness over love, and then she walked out of the house we had planned to fill with a life together, and I did not see her again for almost a year. I would love to tell you that the weeks that followed were easy, that I felt only relief and clarity, but that would not be honest, and I think honesty matters more in stories like this one than easy comfort. I cancelled a wedding that had already been paid for in large part, absorbed the financial loss of deposits on a venue and a caterer and a string quartet that would now play for someone else's happiness instead of mine, and I spent more nights than I care to admit sitting on the back porch of the lake house my mother had left me, watching the water go still and dark as the sun set, wondering if I had thrown away the one chance I had at the kind of love other people seem to find so easily. Grief has a way of visiting twice in situations like this, once for the person you lost, and once for the future you had imagined with them, and I mourned both that summer with an intensity that surprised me. My Aunt Dorothy, who had raised Simon almost single-handedly in the years since our mother's passing, was the person who helped me most during those difficult months. She was in her early 60s, sharp-tongued and soft-hearted in equal measure, the kind of woman who had spent her whole life taking care of other people and had never once complained about it in front of us, though I suspect she complained plenty to herself in quiet moments. When I told her what had happened, she did not offer easy reassurances. She simply hugged me, tightly and without words, and later that evening, over a dinner of overcooked pasta at her small kitchen table, she told me that love which requires you to abandon your responsibilities to the people who cannot protect themselves is not love at all, it is a transaction dressed up in nicer clothes. She reminded me that Simon, who was 29 years old and had a laugh that could fill an entire room despite everything his body had taken from him, deserved a brother who kept his promises, and that our mother, wherever she was, would be proud of the man I had become in that kitchen conversation with Vanessa, even if it had cost me something painful. Simon himself, when I finally told him what had happened in language simple enough for him to fully understand, reached over from his wheelchair and squeezed my hand with more strength than people usually expect from him, and said, in the halting but deeply expressive way he speaks, that he was sorry I was sad, but that he was glad I was still his brother. That sentence undid something in me that I had been holding together through sheer stubbornness for weeks, and I cried in front of him for the first time since our mother's funeral, and he simply sat with me, patient and present, the way he always had been, the way I realized in that moment I would move mountains to protect for the rest of both our lives. The months that followed were quiet ones, not empty, but quiet in the way that healing often requires. I threw myself into work, into long weekends at the lake house helping Dorothy manage Simon's care schedule, into slowly rebuilding a version of myself that felt less defined by what I had lost and more defined by what I had protected. I started volunteering at the same community organization my mother's scholarship fund supported, a small nonprofit that helped families navigate the financial devastation of childhood cancer diagnoses, spending Saturday mornings helping coordinate transportation for families driving in from rural parts of the state for treatment. It was there, on an unremarkable Saturday in early spring, nearly 10 months after Vanessa walked out of my life, that I met Clara Whitmore. Clara was a pediatric social worker, 31 years old, with an unhurried kindness about her that I noticed before I noticed anything else, the way she crouched down to speak directly to frightened children instead of towering over them, the way she remembered small details about families she had met only once, the particular gentleness she brought to conversations that most people found too heavy to hold. We started talking during a lull in volunteer shifts, and I found myself telling her more about my mother, about Simon, about the promise I had made and the ultimatum that had tested it, than I had told almost anyone in the previous year. She listened without trying to fix anything, without offering the kind of easy platitudes people sometimes reach for when faced with someone else's grief, and when I finished talking, she simply said that it sounded like I had chosen love after all, just not the kind that fits neatly into an engagement ring. Our relationship developed slowly, deliberately, in a way that felt entirely different from the whirlwind pace of my time with Vanessa. Clara met Simon within the first month, and rather than treating him as an obligation or an inconvenience, she spent an entire Sunday afternoon teaching him a card game he ended up loving so much that he asked about it every time she visited afterward. She met Dorothy over a dinner that ran 4 hours longer than planned because the two of them discovered a shared love of terrible reality television and could not stop talking about it. She never once asked me about my will, never once mentioned money or inheritance or security in the language Vanessa had used, and it took me nearly 6 months of dating her before I realized that her silence on the subject was not indifference but a kind of quiet respect, an understanding that some things did not need to be negotiated because they were simply part of who I was. It was Clara, in fact, who first brought up the subject of the will herself, nearly a year into our relationship, and in a way that revealed everything about the difference between her and the woman who had come before her. We were sitting on the dock at the lake house on a warm July evening, Simon and Dorothy inside playing the card game Clara had taught him, and she told me that she had heard, secondhand through a mutual friend from the volunteer organization, a little about what had happened with my previous engagement. She said she wanted me to know that she thought what I had done was one of the most quietly brave things she had ever heard of, choosing to protect someone who could not protect himself even when it cost me the future I had planned. She said she hoped that someday, if we built a life together, I would trust her enough to fold her into that circle of protection rather than seeing her as someone who needed to be shielded from it, and that she never wanted to be first in line for anything at the expense of Simon's security, only alongside it, as part of the family rather than instead of it. I proposed to Clara 18 months after we met, on the same dock where she had told me those words, with Simon and Dorothy watching from the porch, and this time when she said yes, I felt none of the uncertainty that had quietly haunted the edges of my first engagement, only a steady, settled kind of joy. In the months of planning that followed, Clara asked me, unprompted, whether we should sit down with Rosalind together to make sure our combined finances and estate planning reflected both of our values, not because she wanted to be named beneficiary of anything, but because she wanted to understand and honor the commitments I had already made, and to make her own alongside them. We ended up restructuring the will once more, this time not out of conflict but out of partnership, naming Clara as a secondary beneficiary who would help oversee Simon's care alongside Dorothy, ensuring that if anything ever happened to me, he would have not one guardian but two people who loved him bound together by choice rather than obligation. I want to pause here and tell you something that happened about 8 months before our wedding, because I think it matters to the shape of this story, and because I believe most stories about heartbreak are incomplete without some measure of what came after for the person who caused the pain. I received an email one afternoon from Vanessa, the first contact I had had with her in nearly 2 years. She wrote that she had spent a long time thinking about what happened between us, that she had gone through a difficult stretch in the aftermath of our breakup, losing a job and struggling with debts she had never told me about during our relationship, debts that I later understood had likely been part of what drove her desperate demand in the first place. She wrote that she had started seeing a therapist, that she had come to understand her own history of financial insecurity had warped her understanding of love into something transactional, a lesson she said she had learned far too late to save what we had, but hopefully in time to build something healthier in whatever relationships came after. She did not ask for anything from me, no reconciliation, no financial help, only the chance to apologize honestly for the position she had put me in, for asking me to abandon my brother's security as proof of my devotion to her. I sat with that email for several days before responding, uncertain of what I owed her, if anything, in the way of forgiveness. In the end, I wrote back a short message, telling her that I appreciated her honesty, that I hoped she continued healing, and that I forgave her, not because what she had done was acceptable, but because carrying that particular anger no longer served the life I was building. I did not tell her about Clara, not out of secrecy but simply because it did not feel like information she needed, and I never heard from her again after that exchange, though I hope, wherever she is now, that she found the security within herself that she had once tried to demand from me through paperwork. If this story has moved you at all, I want to ask you to take a moment before we finish and leave a comment below about what this story means to you, whether it reminded you of a boundary you once had to hold, a promise you kept even when it cost you something, or a moment when you learned that real love does not ask you to abandon the people who depend on you. I read every comment myself, and I believe the lessons in these stories become richer when we share our own experiences alongside them, so please, tell me what stood out to you most. Clara and I were married the following spring, on the same stretch of lawn beside the lake house where I had once spent so many dark evenings wondering if I had ruined my chance at happiness. Simon served as my best man, delivering a toast that took him nearly 10 minutes to get through given the effort required for him to speak at length, and there was not a dry eye among the guests by the time he finished telling the room that his brother had taught him that family means keeping promises even when it is hard, and that Clara had taught him that love means making room for everyone, not just the person standing in front of you. Dorothy cried through the entire ceremony, insisting afterward that it was simply allergies, a claim nobody in the family believed for a moment. My mother was not there to see it, not in any way I could touch or hold, but I felt her presence in the careful choices we had made, in the trust that protected Simon, in the scholarship fund that had, in a strange and beautiful way, led me to the woman I ultimately married, and in the quiet, steady knowledge that I had kept the promise I made to her in that hospital room years before. Looking back on everything now, several years removed from that Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen when Vanessa first delivered her ultimatum, I understand that the moment did not feel like courage while I was living through it. It felt like fear, like grief, like the terrifying possibility that I was choosing loneliness over love, exactly as she had warned me I would. But courage rarely announces itself with confidence in the moment it is required. Most of the time, it looks like sitting at a kitchen table with your hands shaking, unwilling to trade someone else's safety for your own comfort, even when every part of you is desperate for the relationship to survive. I have come to believe that the will I changed that week was never really about money or property or legal documents at all. It was about deciding, in the clearest terms I had ever faced, what kind of man I wanted to be, and what kind of love I was willing to accept into my life and my family. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Stories like Grant's remind us that the people who truly love us will never ask us to abandon the ones who cannot protect themselves, and that sometimes the most painful decisions we make in the moment become the clearest blessings when we look back on them with time and distance. Wherever you are watching this from, whatever quiet promise you might be holding onto in your own life, I hope you find the strength to keep it, and I hope, like Grant, you eventually find someone who does not ask you to choose, but simply asks to stand beside you as you carry it together. Thank you for being part of our community, for sharing in these stories of kindness and forgiveness and hope, and I will see you in the next one.